By the late 1970s, the social topography of Monte Palma was etched in concrete and stone. High upon the northern ridge sat the Estadio Daloma, a functional, no-nonsense stadium rebuilt in the early 70s that looked down upon the older, lower hills of the city. Nestled there was the 17th-century spire of the Parroquia de Nuestra Señora de la Esperanza, a relic of the colonial past. On the 12th of November, 1979, the local side, Palma Central, secured a desperate, late-game victory against their rivals. The win was led by the club's legendary captain, Mateo Montoya, whose final goal triggered a celebration the city was ill-prepared to contain. Upon the final whistle, thousands of supporters flooded out from the stadium and the adjacent historic clubhouse, beginning a human river that flowed down Hillside, funneling the crowd's raw energy into the narrow confines of the Plaza Vieja. The plaza proved a poor fit for the 20th century. As music resonated off the Baroque facade of the Parroquia, the weight of the crowds caused several aging balconies to collapse, while celebratory flares left permanent scars on the church's original oak doors. The night led to a permanent ban on large gatherings within the quarter. The charred timber of the plaza served as a reminder of the night.
Hello, and welcome back to Monte Palma. For this week's episode, we're going to be continuing building out here in this section of the city that we started working on in the last episode. Going to be focusing our attentions on detailing out the area around the church and detailing out this hilltop up here. It has been pointed out to me several times now that people are asking me, where are all the football fields? This is a Latin American country. There has to be football. And yes, of course there has to be football. I have to admit, I am not much of a sports-oriented individual, so I tend to forget about the sports facilities, but we're going to rectify that in this episode by making a very prominent one, football pitch up here at the top of this hill. This isn't going to be a major stadium or anything like that. This is probably going to be like a regional stadium, so it's going to be a little smaller scale. It serves the local population, but as you can tell by our intro, the local population is very, very passionate about their team. So right now I'm just going to be figuring out the layout for the place, smoothing out some of the terrain to make it fit, putting in some parking lots, some road access. I imagine this to be a fairly expansive facility with some, like parks and nicely manicured grounds around it. For this entire area I'm building out, I'm imagining this to be fairly wealthy, so this is going to reflect that in how it looks here. It's going to be a very nice looking park facility. What I want to make sure is that a lot of people come up here to the park area, so I'm going to be adding quite a few little parks in here. None of the larger ones, just the pocket parks. The larger parks will take up way too much space. I am surprised how much these little parks actually attract people. Like, for some strange reasons, the Sims really like hanging out in playgrounds. Don't ask me why, but you always see a ton of people crammed into the playground while they're totally ignoring all the other parks around it. One viewer pointed out to me that one feature of Latin American is like sports clubs. So that's a great idea. It's something I would never have thought of. So I'm going to be adding the UK hotel here as our clubhouse. It's obviously going to be a soccer club. And I'm just going to make sure there's enough path access up here so the Sims can easily get up here. I'm also using the paths for like very narrow residential streets and things like that. Now, to make this football pitch here like a little more substantial than what it is in the base game, I'm just going to add some extra bleachers to the other side. Once again, this isn't like a major stadium, so I'm not going to be making one of those right now. I have seen a very nice football stadium show up in the mod store, and that's probably going to appear somewhere in the game at some point. I just have to figure out a good location for it. Obviously near the capital somewhere. Add a little wear and tear here to the field. I'll come back to that later to finish detailing it out. Right now I'm going to switch my attention to the church and the little plaza in front of it. I'm going to be using a little technique I figured out in the last episode. We're using Sully's grass surfaces here to create a perfect grid, like so. Make a few adjustments here to the path network around it so it sits a little better within it. And now I'm going to use the grass decals here for a template to create a perfect grid. And delete these out so we can see the tile surfaces underneath. As I build this out, I kind of go through a few different phases here as I decide what I'm going to do. I eventually decide that a grid, kind of like a checkerboard pattern here, would be a neat way to handle this. Using the fill tool here to fill in the gaps in between. Works great for the perfectly square areas, but as you can see with the not so square areas, it's still a little clunky with that, but it does speed this up a lot. For some reason, filling it in this way, there's a bit of a mismatch on the tile surfaces. They're the same surface, but it got kind of like a bit of a pattern here. It kind of looks nice. Looks like they've come in and repaired the plaza at some point in the past. I'm also going to be using a net lane here to kind of hide up some of this ragged edge a little bit so it looks a little cleaner. And there we go. There's our plaza. I'm going to use the park zoning cube here to give it a little more functionality so people actually come in and use it. I do wish there was like a proper hangout area where they would just come and hang out. So we have this bench seating. I have to leave it here because if I delete it out, the Sims will come and just kind of sit in mid-air and look like they're hovering there. So we're going to leave that in. Add some invisible path networks here so they can reach it. replace that really ugly fountain in the center with something a little nicer. I'm also going to be adding some planters and shrubs to the edges of the plaza. I'm just using the line tool, set the same spacing as the grid. That way I can get the planters pretty much directly in the center of each square. Now I'm just going to delete out every other one, so a little more access so it's not so crowded here. And I'm going to do the same thing with the shrubs. And delete out every other one as well. Do a quick recolor here. Some of these tile surfaces, make them a little lighter. For the buildings immediately around the plaza, I want this to be fairly historic, because I have a bit of a historic feel to it. As I've said in other episodes, we don't have a huge number of options here, so we'll have to go with the Mediterranean assets for this one. They work quite nice. They do get a little bit repetitive, so I have to be mindful of how I'm using them. For this particular build, I'm imagining that the historic area of this is right around the church, just right at the very top of the hills, at the hilltop. And as we move down the hillside, it becomes much more modern. So I wanted to just make sure these buildings stay in a very tight cluster right at the very top of the hill here. I find just giving these a very quick recolor, make them a little lighter and whiter, add a few bright colors here and there. It does kind of help make it feel a little more Latin American than Mediterranean. I have this rather awkward corner here, which I didn't know what to do with. So I thought what I would do is just build some stair access here so people can get up. Unfortunately, these aren't functional. These are just going to be for decorative purposes right now. If we get to a point where we actually have functional stair assets, I'll come back in here and switch them out for something that the Sims can actually use. Use these structural cubes here to kind of make the landings for the stairway. And at the very bottom here, there's a bit of a mismatch. The stairs don't line up to the ground quite well, so I'm just going to use some larger structural cubes here to make a bit of a transition, like a landing. because of the way the terrain behaves, getting the buildings to actually work on this is a bit of a challenge, and there's a lot of imperfections to the surfaces. This is up a little bit. I forgot to hit record for a little section here, so here's just a quick overshot of the historic neighborhood at the very top of the hill. This turned out really nice. I was very happy with this. I don't want it any larger than this. I don't want it to look really European. The perfect way to do that is add some really ugly residential towers right next to it. At the top of this ridge line here, I'm going to be putting in a fair number of higher towers. I have this really massive, impressive bridge here that connects it, and there needs to be some rationale for why they would build that bridge. The most obvious solution would be to increase the population footprint or the density of this section of the city. That's what all these towers are going to represent here. I'm just putting these down to get an idea of what I might want this area to look like. Nothing here is set in stone quite yet. I'm not really focused on building this. I just want to put it in a few towers, give me an idea of what this might look like. For some of the buildings, I'm using a combination of functional assets and static assets. Like right here, I'm using one functional one and a couple of static ones, and then I can stick them into the ground, kind of give this step look, make them look something a little more unique looking. Once again, I'm dealing with a fairly hilly area, so this is going to be that technique I've been using to fill this in with dense residential neighborhoods. I'm going to move through this fairly quickly. I've shown this many times in many other episodes. If you want to watch me do it in a little more detail, you could go back and watch one of those. It's the same technique every time. I do want here, though, because we're overlooking this beautiful bay, there's going to be some more expensive houses. This is a richer neighborhood than some of the other areas in the city, and I want some of the architecture here to reflect it. It's kind of a bit of a mixed bag. It's like all over the place. There's some very expensive homes, and then there's also going to be some very modest homes. They're all going to look fairly nice. It's not like an impoverished neighborhood by any stretch. I've seen that in the upcoming patch for the game, they're going to give us a little more control over the terrain tools. They're going to become a little more fine grained. So this is what I'm doing here, having to adjust the terrain to match the buildings. I'll have a little more control over that, so a little nicer transitions between the two. So I'm looking forward to that. I can't wait to give it a try, see if it actually helps with some of this building. These little square houses here, these are such a great asset to fill in some of these awkward gaps. They work so well. You just position them, we just have some windows facing outward, hide the door fronts, and they look pretty good. One issue I've been struggling with quite a bit, especially during this episode, I don't know how many hours I spent trying to solve the issue, was I have a demographic inversion. At the moment, Monte Palma's population, over 50% of it are senior citizens, and no matter what I would try to do, I couldn't seem to rectify the problem. Turns out it's a bug. I started Monte Palma on easy mode because I didn't want to be overly burdened by the simulation, because I knew what I was building here was, it's more focused on the visuals, not so much on the simulation for Monte Palma. And it turns out in easy mode, the seniors just don't die. And so that's why that problem has been happening. So when the patch comes out, there's going to be a bit of chaos while that sorts itself out. But I'm looking forward to seeing the demographics return to something a little more reasonable. The main issue with the demographics being the way they are, there's no growth in the city. There's no demand for commercial, office, industry. As you see, all those demand bars are just flatlined. And that's the reason why everybody's retired. Maybe it's a retirement paradise, I'm not sure. I really like this building. I'm not sure if I really like it here, so this might change. And that one's definitely not going to say it. Two different buildings of the same height. That looks a bit weird, so we're going to delete that one out. And I'm going to be continuing this seawall structure along the waterfront. I was having a little issue here with the leisure pier I'm using to do this. It interacts with the ground, so you see that distortion there in the upper section. It turned out the solution to that is just using a wider path wrapping around the tower. For the detailing points of interest for this build, it's obviously the church plaza and stadium sports complex up on the top of the hill. The rest of the neighborhood, I'm kind of aiming for like mid-level of detailing, so it's not going to be super highly detailed, just enough so it looks okay from a bit of a distance. This was a bit tricky to do here. It's not only is it a hill, it's also kind of like a bit of a bowl shape. So trying to figure out the road layout and the buildings they're using here was a bit of a challenge. A lot of the times I'm using static buildings for the low density housing to fill in the hillsides, and I've been using the zoning cubes to kind of give them a bit of functionality. What I've been finding is a lot of the times those zoning cubes tend to break and they lose connections to the road, so I end up with stuck citizens needing ambulances or hearses or things like that. and I have to come back and delete those things out to get rid of them. So I've been kind of shying away from it a little bit. I'm not using them as much, but I do need to, I also want I don't want these areas to be completely dead and just purely scenic and don't serve any function. Also, this area in here, with this area overlooking the bay, I'm imagining this to be fairly desirable for real estate. People want to live here because the view is so wonderful. So what I've done here is there's a few low-rise apartment buildings that can take advantage of the view, and then scattered in amongst them are lower density houses. I really do wish there were a lot more buildings with a width of 1 or 2 squares with no yards around them. That would make building these hillside communities a lot easier to do. For some of the really steep sections where it's really impossible to put any functional building, I'm going to use some static assets. I've always found this little technique of using 2 of them back to back, one to the higher section, one to the lower section. Fills in the hillside quite nicely. They look very convincing. There might be a bit of jank along the bottom, and there's things you can do to hide that, like some trees and shrubs always works very well to hide it, but it does fill in these hillsides in a very nice way that looks very convincing. For this little section I'm working on right here, something like procedural objects would have come in very, very handy for this sort of building in here. But yeah, these rather generic square-looking buildings, these are great for filling in all sorts of gaps and awkward spots. At least with this sort of architecture I'm going for here, it might not be so easy to do with, like, say, the North American assets, but these European waterfront buildings here work very, very well in this sort of setting to build this kind of neighborhood. Something that's really started to annoy me quite a bit was, I'm not sure why it is, with pretty much all the assets, the backsides of them are really kind of plain and uninteresting and really boring, which totally ignores the fact, like say where I'm building right here with this beautiful bay, it would be the roadside that would be very dull and uninteresting, and the backside overlooking the bay would be full of balconies and where all the, really the nice facade of the building would be facing. And there's practically no building in game that actually looks like that. So what I've been trying to do is figure out ways I could splice in the assets to kind of like give balconies and such overlooking the bay, which makes much more logical sense to me. Okay, so I'm going to be doing a bit of the detailing for that area of the city off camera. And for the last bit of the episode here, we're going to focus our attention back on the stadium. I decided during the course of this build that it needed to be just a little larger in size than how I built it the first time here. So I'm going to be adding to the center bleachers here, we're just going to be adding an upper level. Once again, it's a small regional stadium, so it's not super large. I think it has, if I had to guess for the capacity, it's probably maybe a couple thousand. Probably squeeze in a few more hundred on a really important game. They probably pack people in, but it's not a huge place. And now we're just going to clean up the surfaces for around the parks and make sure everything feels unified, polish it up a little bit, add some landscaping to it, make it look pretty. thought it'd be a good idea to add a small concession stand here for the stadium. Now for the clubhouse. For the clubhouse, going with one of the UK hotels. It looks like a nice historic building. I also thought maybe, make this a bit more like a ritzy club here. We're going to add some tennis courts as well. Cover up the surfaces here with something a little nicer looking than this orange one. This whole front entrance to the clubhouse goes through a few changes. I don't really like how this is lining up, so I'm going to switch it out for a roundabout. This took a little bit of fiddling around with roads and stuff to get the roundabout to actually stay there. And I have to do a bit of adjustments to some of the surfaces here to get this to line up properly. And to give the building some functionality, I'm going to turn it into a tourist destination. So for sightseeing, there's going to be like restaurant services, entertainment services, and I'm going to hide that was inside the clubhouse building. I can't get rid of the hotel sign on the front there, unfortunately. So I just have to live with that. Maybe at some point in the past it was a hotel. Add a little signature building here to make it even more attractive to tourists. Finish it up with some final landscaping around the edges, some trees, hide some of the roads. Just do some final detailing around the tennis courts here. Anyway, thank you so much for sticking around to the very end of the video. Watching the very end is the clearest signal you can send to the YouTube algorithm to show this video to more people. So thank you very much. I do appreciate it. I will see you all in the next episode. Next episode, we're back in Redmont. Anyway, everybody take care, and I will see you next week. Bye.